Welcome, everyone. Sorry about that. So as you may have heard, we've had some energy here on campus. There is a protest outside the 900 room. And so we've been talking with the protesters. Professor Lehman is out there talking to them now. I was just speaking with them and there are concerns that they have raised, and we've been welcoming them into the conversation. And they're exercising their right to not do so. But we are all here, you are all here, and we're happy that you can join us. To first start off, I want to welcome you all. This deliberative panel and forum is on parents and schools who should teach our kids about race, gender, and sexuality. My name is Graham Bullock, and I'm a professor of political science at Davidson College and the faculty director of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, or DCI for short. The DCI is happy to be co-hosting tonight's event with Davidson College's Educational Studies and Political Science departments. We're also excited to be hosting our first hybrid forum with both in-person and virtual participation options. And so welcome again to everyone online and in person. And I'm going to apologize in advance if there's any technical issues with this, because we're figuring it out. Before we get started, I want to let you know we've enabled live auto transcription for this event. If you'd like to enable this, you can click the More button and then select Show Subtitles. Please note that these captions are automated, so they may not always be accurate. We also encourage you to switch to speaker view in Zoom, as we are here in the 900 room, as we will be spotlighting the speakers, and it'll be easier to see who is talking in that view. So just go up to view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and select speaker view. So now that you can hopefully see me, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight for the DCI's first deliberative forum of 2022-23 school year, following our events on economic mobility and free speech and inclusion last year. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about the DCI, which you can learn more about on our website. Its purpose is to create opportunities for Davidson students, faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the wider community to productively engage with one another on difficult and important issues facing our community and society. So how to teach our children about contentious issues, social issues like race, gender, and sexuality is certainly one of these issues, as well-meaning and well-informed people can differ on whose responsibility this work should be, how it should be conducted, and what it should cover. To help us better understand and explore these diverse perspectives, we've paired a great panel of experts with an opportunity for all of you to talk about these difficult issues in small groups after the panel. So we have 16 trained DCI facilitators ready to facilitate these discussions and lead you through the deliberation guide that we shared with you previously and is available on the website. If you go to deliberative, I'll put it in the chat in a few minutes. It's under deliberativecitizenship.org and then under upcoming. So as you know, tonight's event is free of charge. The only thing we ask is that you join the small group discussions after the panel. These discussions are the primary purpose of the event, and they're designed to catalyze, the panel is designed to catalyze your conversations with your fellow citizens. They're a great opportunity for you to both express your own ideas and questions while listening to those of others in your group. But first, our DCI fellows will introduce our panelists. Before I ask them to come up here, I would like to say a few words about how we constructed this panel and what our sort of design was. So we wanted, given its relevance to the upcoming midterms and last year's elections in Virginia, we wanted to organize something related to the controversies about what is being taught in our schools about complex social topics. But it was a little bit daunting to do this, as there are so many different issues caught up in these debates, and we struggle with how to include the full range of these controversies without it becoming overwhelming. Our solution was to focus the event around the broader question of educational responsibility. Who should teach our kids about X? As a way to frame the specific cases of race, gender, and sexuality. We developed a deliberation guide that provides a lot of background information about each of these issues, as well as arguments from diverse points of view about how they should be resolved. For the panel, we considered including a very wide range of voices, but we are concerned that such an approach would inevitably leave some perspectives out. In working on this topic, we learned how positions on this issue do not map perfectly to demographic and ideological differences. For example, some Democrats, Republicans, whites, people of color, and LGBTQ+ community members are in favor of stronger school responsibility on these and other issues, while some others are skeptical of school bureaucracies and emphasize more parental responsibility. To provide the full range of these perspectives, we might need a really, really large panel. And so from our perspective, even a panel of 4 to 5 people speaking for just 45 minutes has difficulty really getting beyond the basics and diving into the issues. So instead, for this event, we opted for a smaller panel of experts in this field who could speak to the broader issues and questions that underlie these controversies. As you will see, these panelists have very different perspectives on this topic, and we have encouraged them to deeply engage in what has been called good argument, not quarreling, but a vigorous and rigorous exchange of reasons with one another. And they will be guided by our moderator, Dr. Lehman, who will work to ensure they engage with a full range of perspectives and arguments on this topic, including and especially those that neither panelist necessarily holds. This can and may be a difficult conversation in the sense that we may find ideas expressed to be difficult, disturbing, or hurtful. That is often the case with engaging with difference and getting outside of our ideological bubbles. And it is arguably the price that we pay for living in a pluralistic and deliberative democracy. The alternative is a world in which we don't deliberate on difficult topics, but rely on raw power to get our way. That, I believe, inevitably leads to much, much greater pain and hurt. And the experience of those living under authoritarian regimes around the world attests to this. Now, it is true, these harms from deliberation may fall disproportionately on some groups, but the process of deliberation can reveal those disproportionate impacts and catalyze ways to reduce them. This process must begin, however, with a willingness to engage with ideas we find immoral, untrue, or even abhorrent. This is in part why it is part of Davidson's statement of purpose to provide opportunities for civil debate and teach students to communicate freely with others in the realm of ideas. And through this process, we may learn that facts and assumptions we hold to be true are not as straightforward as we had originally thought. The basic norm of deliberative reciprocity suggests that if you want others to be open to changing their minds, we need to be open to changing our own. So Professors Black and Mischella, as you'll see and learn from their introductions, can help us with this process by presenting their own viewpoints on this issue and challenging each other on them. As nationally recognized and highly regarded public intellectuals, they have thought deeply and published extensively about the topic in question. No doubt they hold views that some of you will find problematic. And having them as part of our panel to explain, defend, and expand on their views is an opportunity for us to better understand why they hold these views and why we disagree or agree with them. And then critically, everyone who is in attendance will have the opportunity to engage with one another in our facilitated small groups on these same questions, listening, sharing, and exploring the complexities of this topic. It is true that positions of differing social power can make deliberation more or less difficult for different people. But we nevertheless have very good reason to do the hard work of creating a deliberative space despite those barriers and in ways that reduce them, starting with, fundamentally, our commitment to egalitarianism and everyone's equal right to be at the table, virtual or in person. So with that, I want to invite some of our DCI fellows to come introduce our speakers tonight, and start with Brody. Can you come up and introduce Dr. Black?
Derek Black is professor of law in the Ernest F. Hollings Chair in Constitutional Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. Professor Black's work focuses on school funding and equality for disadvantaged students. In his books, Education, Law, Equality, Fairness, and Reform, and Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy, and articles on the fundamental right to education and charter schools vouchers and the public good are particularly relevant to the forum's topic. Professor Black began his career litigating education cases at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law and teaching at Howard University School of Law, where he founded the Education Rights Center. He received his JD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his BA in African American Studies, Philosophy, and Political Science from the University of Tennessee.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And Miles, can you come up and introduce Dr. Moschello? Go ahead.
Melissa Moschello is an associate professor in the School of Philosophy at Catholic University. She has written extensively on parents' rights, including her dissertation on parental rights in education, her 2016 Cambridge University Press book on To Whom Do Children Belong, Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, and a recent paper in the Notre Dame Journal of Law, Ethics, and Public Policy on defending the fundamental rights of parents, a response to recent attacks. Professor Moschello is also a McDonald Distinguished Fellow at the Emory University for the Study of Law and Religion, and has served as a Miser Fellow at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. She has received her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University.
Okay, thank you, Miles, for that introduction. And we are getting Dr. Lehman online for him to begin his introduction, his moderation of the panel. And I'm going to just check to see if there's anyone else in the waiting room. There we go. You're in. Okay, great. And Dr. Lehman, so welcome. So Dr. Lehman is a professor, associate professor of philosophy here at Davidson. And he's also a co-convener of the DCI, and he's here to help guide our conversation with our two panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan.
Derek and Melissa, we're so happy to have you here. I'm excited for a really engaging and exciting and topical discussion today on these issues. I'd like to begin, Melissa, by inviting you to give us a statement of the core of your position, and then we'll go from there.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks to everybody who organized this. I really do think it's so important that there be opportunities for people to engage in real difficult discussions on controversial issues, discussions that don't try to avoid the controversy, but that really engage the arguments on all sides. So I'm very excited to have this this opportunity to be a part of this. So in my opening remarks, I'd like to focus not directly on the particular educational controversies under discussion. We can, I'm sure, get to that later on. But rather, I want to focus on what I believe to be the more foundational issue at stake here, both morally and legally, because I think that these debates ultimately come down to whether or not it is right for the state, through the public schools, to teach children highly controversial views about sensitive issues, not just to expose them to those views as a matter for debate, but to present them as truth. And to do this despite the objections of a significant number of parents. In other words, the debate comes down to whether the state can use its coercive power to teach controversial views to students despite parents' objections. And I say coercive here because education is legally compulsory and because public schools in almost every state have a monopoly on public educational funding, meaning that parents have to pay a significant financial penalty if they believe they need to send their child to a private school because of disagreement about what the public school is teaching. And that for many parents, public school is really the only feasible option. Now, I should say from the outset that I think the state can legitimately require that certain things be taught. For instance, that children receive a basic academic education, learn about our nation's history and government, be taught basic values like fairness, kindness, mutual respect, and so on. I think that the justices in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the landmark Supreme Court case on parental rights in education, got it right when they said that the state can require studies which are, quote, plainly essential to good citizenship. But I think that phrase, plainly essential, is crucial. For by definition, any content that a significant number of citizens believe to be harmful fails to meet this bar. On such non-essential and controversial matters, therefore, I think that the state has the obligation, both moral and constitutional, to defer to parents, whom the Supreme Court, following a long common law tradition, has recognized as having natural authority to direct their children's education and upbringing, authority which is prior to the state and which the state has an obligation to respect. Now, this idea that parents have natural rights and obligations to direct their children's education and upbringing has largely been taken for granted in our history and throughout most civilizations. Parental rights have been affirmed as fundamental by the Supreme Court and also by the United Nations. But it's a view that a number of scholars have attempted to call into question, particularly in recent years, and therefore that cannot be taken for granted. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the underlying moral and philosophical foundations of parental rights as I understand them. So parental rights are really about parents' authority to make decisions about what's in the best interests of their children. So to understand where parental rights come from, we have to understand the basis of parental authority. Now, everybody agrees that someone has to have authority over children because they can't make decisions for themselves. That's what it means to be a child, to lack decisional maturity. So then the question is, well, who has that authority to make decisions on behalf of children? Now, in general, I think that authority over children is derived from responsibility for their well-being. And that, as a general philosophical and ethical matter, your degree of responsibility for somebody else's well-being depends on the nature and intimacy of your relationship with that person, including the extent to which that person is dependent on you. So in order to figure out who has primary authority over children, we need to figure out who initially has the closest relationship to a child and therefore the strongest responsibility for that child. And I think that the answer to that is pretty easy. Initially, at least, the child's closest relationship is the biological relationship that he has with his biological parents. And I'll say something about adoptive parents in a moment. But for now, I want to focus on the biological parent-child relationship because I think it helps us understand the natural responsibilities and rights of parents, which adoptive parents take on when biological parents can't or won't fulfill their role. The parent-child relationship grounds parents' primary responsibility to take care of the child until maturity, which implies the authority to carry out this task. Because of the existing relationship, both biological and psychological, that a child has with her parents, the child is personally dependent on those parents. The parent-child relationship is unique. It's a permanent, literally identity-defining link. Even if a child is not raised by her biological parents, that link is there and it's important, as many who are not raised by their biological parents will tell you. Now, what about adoption? Of course, in non-ideal circumstances, when biological parents can't or won't raise their child, adoption will be the best option for meeting the child's needs. And adoptive parents are true parents with the same obligations and rights. But the difference is that their obligations to their children and corresponding rights derive initially from their commitment to take on parental responsibilities, while the obligations of biological parents derive from the already existing relationship that they have to their children. My emphasis on the biological tie here is because it helps us to see why parental authority is natural and pre-political rather than derived from the state's authority. To borrow a metaphor that I like from Thomas Aquinas, it's just as natural for children to be raised to maturity within what he calls the spiritual womb of their family, under the authority and care of their parents, as it is for children to be gestated in the physical womb of their mothers. While physical gestation only lasts 9 months, human beings have a very long period of psychological, moral, and intellectual gestation that takes place outside the physical womb and doesn't end until the child reaches a level of maturity at which he or she can direct his own life. Like the physical womb, the family is a spiritual womb, a protected sphere within which children can grow to maturity. And from this spiritual womb, children are then born into the larger society as adults. Thus, parents have natural authority over their children that corresponds to unchanging features of human nature and deep human needs. The state didn't create the parent-child relationship any more than it created a woman's womb. And it's not from the state that parents get their authority. They have that authority by nature, and the state has an obligation to respect it. Now, it's true, of course, that children are also members of the larger political community, but only indirectly. Human beings are nested within various levels of community, kind of like the Russian nesting dolls. Children belong first and foremost to their families headed by their parents, who are the ones with the most direct obligation and authority to care for them until maturity. As a result, children's relationship to the larger political community is fundamentally different from that of adults because it's mediated through their belonging to a family and being under the authority of their parents. Just as, for instance, my relationship to the United Nations is mediated through my United States citizenship. Now, there are times when the state may be justified in breaking into the spiritual womb of the family and interfering coercively with the way parents raise their children. But the justifications for this are similar to the justifications for international intervention into the affairs of a sovereign state, namely to stop serious human rights abuses or serious harm to the international order. Analogously, coercive intervention in the family sphere is justified only to stop genuine abuse or neglect or to prevent serious harm to the public order. And because parental rights are fundamental, I believe that the state should be held to what legal scholars call the strict scrutiny standard for policies that burden those rights. And this means that burdens on parental rights are only legally justified if they are the least burdensome way to achieve a compelling state interest. I will, I'm sure, have the chance to say more in the course of the discussion about some general policy implications of this view. But for now, I'll end just by saying that avoiding mandatory curricular content in public schools that many parents find objectionable would, I think, be a good place to start. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Derek, would you like to have a first reply?
Sure, and thanks to you, Professor Dr. Lehman, and to Dr. Bullock as well for pulling this together, and for Dr. Mashallah for participating. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully I can keep up. I'm a little bit scattered in the brain today. I fortunately don't have COVID, but I do have something. So, I guess it's good that we're on Zoom, so that didn't create a problem. But you know, and excited to be part of this conversation as team. And these are important conversations to have and this back and forth. But I'm just going to jump into it and really just give some very brief remarks about sort of where I come at this issue, and then actually just go ahead and get it into the debate format and respond to a couple of points that were made. But you know, my sort of underlying premise here, which is a constitutional premise, is that the state, through its public schools, you know, ensures a baseline of opportunity. And so what we are discussing, or at least my frame of view, is not a question of sort of superior rights necessarily, because I think some of those that sort of baseline that the state can ensure and that the parents want overlap. And to the extent that the parents don't want that, they have options. Now, there may be financial consequences to that, but the state is not compelling attendance at a public school per se, right? That there is the option of a private school. And then there's also the question of sort of getting along, right? I mean, there are certain things the state doesn't do, not because it lacks the authority, not because it's illegitimate, but because the political process says we'll go no further than that. And so I lay those out as a couple of points. But I do think that sort of equitable access to a baseline is crucially important, and that the reason why we have such a system is twofold. One is to protect the individual, him or herself, right? That it's not about the family, to be quite honest. It's about the individual sort of ability to pursue a career in adulthood and to be a citizen in adulthood. And absent that state goal, we might question, why do we even have public schools at all, right? They're not there necessarily for a convenience factor, but they are a democratic reinforcing institution. Not perfect, never been perfect, don't expect that it will be in my lifetime. But if we look at the 50 state constitutions and all the constitutional provisions mandating the delivery of education, they're all premised on the idea that the state has an affirmative duty as well. It's not just parents. The state has an affirmative duty to deliver a public education to all students to reinforce democracy. And again, that's partly for the individual, but partly for democracy itself. Let me then just sort of respond to a couple of points and really about Pierce. So Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which Dr. Michelle mentioned earlier, has another part to it as well, which is actually quite radical. That Pierce recognizes the state's ability to actually even interfere in private schools. That it says that they can regulate private schools to the extent they want to ensure that nothing inimical to the civic good is taught there. So it's not just Pierce stands for two things, right? Well, maybe three, but certainly a parental right, certainly the right of the state to run its own schools, and actually the state's right to interfere in private schools when they may cross certain boundaries. And the final point, and this is one that makes parental rights and the right to control the upbringing of children so interesting to teach, because that notion of a parental right constitutionally, now morally, politically, we could talk about, but as a constitutional right is far narrower than most people tend to construe it. And it's not just a burden, it's a substantial infringement. So when we look at all of fundamental rights, it's not simply that the state has burdened them, it's that it has substantially burdened them or substantially infringed them. And that is a predicate to bringing any fundamental rights claim in court, whether it be free speech, the right to bear arms, any of these things. And so what concerns me about some current discourse is that instead of looking at substantial infringements, there's the immediate insistence that you can't even sort of burden or offend that right. And I think that's a far more aggressive approach to fundamental rights than exists across other fundamental rights. So with that, I'll stop and hand it back over to Dr. Lehman to generate the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Professor Black. Professor Michelle, would you like to say anything about the role of education in democracy, in creating the democratic citizen, maybe as opposed to or simply in relation to the aim of creating someone with various kinds of basic competence? What does it take for schools, public or otherwise, to make adequate democratic citizens? And how, if at all, does that generate obligations on the part of schools and possibly limit rights on the part of parents?
Right. So, I mean, I think that the authority of the state to be an educational actor and to enact coercive educational provisions, like, for instance, compulsory education laws, which every state has. I think that authority comes from the state's legitimate civic interest in ensuring that the next generation grows up with the capacity to be law-abiding, responsible, relatively self-sufficient citizens, right? Capable of helping the country to prosper, and of engaging and fulfilling their civic duties in adulthood. So I think that, on my view, is where state authority in this sphere primarily comes from. And that authority is very important, and it's the reason why, I mean, Professor Black is correct that the state does have some authority to regulate public schools, and it exercises that authority in a variety of relatively non-controversial ways. But again, that authority, and I think, we may have slightly different interpretations of Pierce and of the prior common law tradition that it's building on. But I think that this constitutional tradition recognizes that state authority in these matters is limited in a significant way by the prior authority of parents, and that the state, when it's operating kind of within its lane, sees itself primarily as both forcing parents to fulfill their educational duty and helping parents to fulfill their educational duty, in part because the state in this line of cases as well recognizes quite reasonably that parents typically are the ones with the best knowledge of what's in their children's best interests and the greatest motivation to promote those best interests, including to promote a good education for their child that will prepare their child for success later in life.
So if I can just quickly follow up, you mentioned there, the importance of creating young people who will become adults who can be productive, fulfill their civic duties. But of course, that falls short of being something like deliberative citizens, right? So where the norm of deliberative citizenship is something more demanding than holding down a job and, maybe even voting, right? So it's typically idealized as something like the capacity to understand and give and receive reasons to fellow citizens on grounds that are both accessible to those fellow citizens and are grounded in some kind of level of respect for the citizens to whom the reasons are given. And certainly one argument is that insofar as that aim exists as a proper goal of education, it is incumbent upon schools to make sure that students develop respect for the various kinds of identities that actually constitute the democratic citizenry, lest they be ill-equipped or unequipped to be democratic citizens themselves. So interested to hear you respond to that line of argument in particular.
Sure. I mean, frankly, I'm not aware of anybody who has an objection to teaching students that they have to respect everybody, that they have to treat all people with respect, even if they very much disagree with them, how they view themselves, how they act, and so on, but they have to treat them with respect as a person, which doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with everything that they do or every behavior that they engage in. I think where things get problematic is teaching about these issues in ways that require affirmation of controversial ideologies, not just respect for persons.
Yeah, and I'm just following this up because I think it's important in light of what's happening right now on this campus. So there are students here who have expressed to me today that they cannot operate as members of an equal polity when it's permissible in schools, or as they say, their identities and lives and histories to be, as they say, erased, but at least not treated as being on a par with those of their cis or white or other students and citizens. So what do we say to these students who are here and they feel that their very identities are being sort of erased from the democratic process by the kind of policies that you're affirming? So what do we say to them?
I mean, I would say that I am sad that they feel that way. I certainly do not want them to feel that way, or don't want them to take from anything that I have written on any of these matters to imply any lack of respect for them as persons. But I think that in today's society, we again have gone from being able to respect a person without expecting that that person will agree with you about everything, or applaud every aspect of your behavior to the expectation or a kind of definition of respect that means complete affirmation of everything about you and your behavior. I don't expect that from other people. Other people may disagree with, they certainly disagree with some of my views and apparently some of the things that I write. Great, right? I'd like to have a conversation about that. I think that's where respect comes in, to say, look, we're human beings. We're sharing at the very least the common good of trying to get to the heart of difficult questions and trying to talk together about that, even though it may be uncomfortable in some respects because we feel very deeply about some of these issues. But I think it fundamentally comes down to a difference in what we mean by mutual respect.
Thanks. And Professor Black, I want to go to something you said about the compulsory character that Professor Michela mentioned of education. You pointed out that in some sense, of course, public education is not compulsory, and that's certainly true. But of course, it is true that, you know, in many cases, it's significantly more costly or difficult, whether it just simply monetarily or in time or effort or burdens on lifestyle and so forth for students to, for parents to choose a private or at least non-public education. So on the face of it, at least has the look of something somewhat compulsory, even if not totally coercive or compulsory. So why should we not be concerned if we do think that parents have some significant sort of standing over the children? Why should we not be concerned about that level of coercion or compulsion in this situation?
Well, I think there's 2 points I'd make there. The first is the difference between exposure and indoctrination. So even when we're talking about non-controversial things, to be quite honest, the state cannot compel beliefs in non-controversial things either, right? And so I think no one's taken the position legally that the state can indoctrinate children on anything. And I think, so that's point number one, right? You know, you don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance, you don't have to say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? You think, you know, Wuthering Heights stinks, write it up, right? Whatever you want to do, right? The state can't compel you to like any of those things, but it can expose you to them, right? It can require you to remain in the classroom while everyone else you know, pledges allegiance. It can require you to read the book and write a book report, but not affirm, you know, the validity of it. So number one is that sort of that line, which is an important one. And a lot of the current conversation, I'm not directing this at Melissa, but current conversation assumes a level of compulsion that, quite frankly, I don't believe exists, right? Sort of that exposure itself is compulsion. Now, it is true that if you're told, you hear a thing enough, you might grow akin to it. At the same time, you watch the same TV show enough, you begin to hate it, even if it was great to begin with. So I'm not so sure that solves it. So number one is to recognize that line. And the other one, I think, is just quite practical. I mean, as someone who spends a good deal of his time trying to perfect our implementation of the Constitution, you know, the truth is, you know, dims the brakes, like that's the way it is, right? And saying that the state is going to deliver a public education and it's free, and if you don't like it, you got to go somewhere else. Like, that's just the brakes, right? That the state has one function, its primary function is to sort of this reinforcing of the individual, reinforcing of democracy. You know, that's not going to work for everyone. And the truth is, and look, you know, I advocate on behalf of poor kids all the time. And the truth is, poor kids, even if they don't like it, don't get to leave. But at least in a system with lots of inequality that exists outside the school building, that's just the way it is. I don't think we should get in the business of blaming schools because of all the inequality that exists outside of them.
Professor Michela, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, there are several points, but I think first, I actually really think the distinction between exposure and indoctrination is extremely important, particularly when we're talking about these controversial issues. But I think I disagree, at least, about some of the curricular elements that I have seen in terms of whether they count as exposure or indoctrination. So if you think, for instance, about the policy in Albemarle County School District in Virginia, one which is currently being litigated because a number of parents have serious concerns about it. Their anti-racism policy, which was adopted a couple of years ago, it includes elements like, telling all white students that they have to acknowledge and understand their privilege and sort of confess this before the class. It requires students to commit to, dismantling structures of oppression, including Christianity, which is among those, and so on and so forth. It's not being presented as, here's a theory about racism, and here's a theory about what is required to be somebody who is not racist, right? It just says, look, if you don't want to be racist, you have to accept all of these things. And if you want to pass this course, you have to accept all of these things and affirm them.
Well, I was just going to say, also finding points of agreement, so, and I don't know what all, and it doesn't really matter to me what Dr. Michelle may have said and one thing or another. I'm here to talk about the debate that's put before us, and that's what I want to focus on. And so, I'll say that, and this is true of all things. This is true of teaching reading. This is true of teaching math. This is true of teaching social studies, and also true of dealing with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Implementation is never perfect, right? We haven't found out how to teach math and reading in a way that serves all students in the way that the standards say, much less diversity, equity, and inclusion. Which is not to excuse failure, but I think to Dr. Michelle's point, I have my own reservations, quite honestly, about the way some material has been taught. To me, this is a failure, not of the theory, but sort of the failure of the implementation, or hiring the wrong person to do the job if it's a consultant. So, I think that's where a lot of our controversies actually happen, is that we're sort of talking by each other so often, instead of talking about what a good and appropriate diversity and equity inclusion curriculum looks like. We sort of get, what I might say is an indoctrinating one, which may or may not be the one we need. At the same time, we sort of get the other side and say, well, if that's happening, then I get to pull my kid out of school and teach them whatever I want to. Well, I don't think that's a good idea either. So I just sort of acknowledge, I think, sort of extreme points on both sides of that. But and I'll just stop with that.
Yeah, so in the interests of finding points of contact rather than talking past, let's try to get sort of precisify what's at issue in a case like Albemarle. So let's just accept, for the sake of argument, that in that case, students were being in some way forced or compelled or urged to sort of assert or affirm some kind of substantive doctrine. Let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that in fact that had not occurred in the situation, critical race theory or something about, I don't know, white fragility or the 1619 Project or something was simply being taught, right, was there, and some student and some parent did object to its being taught, not to its being indoctrinated, right? So suppose we had a case like that. In your view, Professor Michelle, does that parent still have standing to insist that not be done in the event that there is in fact not indoctrination? Or does this parent retain that right even if it's not meeting the standards of indoctrination?
Well, like I said, I think that the standard in Pierce, where it talks about what can be kind of compelled, that it ought to be something that can be defended as plainly essential to good citizenship, should be taken into account here. And I agree, some form of teaching, students need to be aware of problems of racism that exist, of the history of racism and slavery and terrible injustices that have happened in the past in our country, right? All of that, I think, could be justified as plainly essential to good citizenship. But is a kind of hyper race conscious curriculum along the lines of kind of critical race theory inspired ideas helpful for overcoming racial discrimination and racial divides? There are people of goodwill and people, Black, white, brown, of all colors and nationalities, who have very different views about whether that's helpful. Many of the parents who are objecting to the curriculum are not white. And they're objecting to it precisely because they think it's harmful to their child to all of a sudden be hyper conscious of themselves as a racial minority, whereas in the past, the child never had an issue with it. So I think that these are matters where the benefits are perhaps unclear. The risks are there. And so it seems that the justification for a policy that would kind of force all students to be exposed to this is lacking in this case.
Professor Black, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I don't, Pierce doesn't set the floor for what the state can do in terms of education. I mean, ultimately, Pierce arises in a very unusual set of facts, which is the state trying to shut down private schools. So the issue in that case is not sort of the full might of the state in a public school. It's the limit of the state's authority as vis-a-vis private schools. And I think there's plenty of public school precedent out there that sort of explores further what the state can do. And the court's clear over the course of multiple cases about the state's ability to inculcate values in students. And in fact, that is one of their primary functions to do that. Now, again, we don't have time to not talk about well, what all are the values that it ought to be. We could talk maybe the principles of how we get there. But so number one, Pierce is not the floor nor the ceiling of what the state can do. As to race, I mean, I think, I should say I know, or at least I believe I know, I should be careful in political debate, but I believe that I know that no other issue in public education has more undermined equal opportunity than race and racism. And so I do think that states and in society outside of school. So I think there is a particularly if schools' role is to promote equal opportunity, there is a particularly special obligation on issues of race. Again, how we go about teaching that, that we could get there, but I at least say that the state does have a special obligation here, and it is derelict in its duty if it ignores that reality, because we don't have to go very far to see that African American students are suspended at 3 to 4 times the rate of white students. If you compare white females, African American females, it's more like 8 times. We can control for socioeconomic status, we can control for behavior. That might shrink those a little bit, but it still doesn't eliminate it. And as I used to say in jest to my students, I would be at school. I say, I'm relatively confident that I could take a brick of cocaine and tape it to my chest and drive home each night and not be accosted. But I would never dare suggest that the students of color could do that. And so, I mean, the reality is that I do have, as a white male, sort of a different ability to walk through this world. That is, I believe, an empirical fact. Whether people like it or not, I believe that to be an empirical fact.
Well, that was good enough that I'll just let you reply, Professor Michelle, and no need for me to intervene.
I'll just say something briefly about Pierce. I mean, I don't deny that racism exists and that racial injustices, continue to exist, and that we need to work on this in our society. That wasn't my point. The point was more, again, about the limits of what the state can teach children, and not just expose them to, but teach them as true without teaching them that it's controversial, that there are opposing viewpoints, and so on. And I think, with regard to the constitutional standard in Pierce, obviously, there's a lot that is not settled. The Supreme Court has really only taken a handful of cases directly related to education, few and far between. But I think that if you look at the common law history, right, the prior history in state courts that Pierce was effectively affirming, to me, that history speaks in favor of more expansive rights of parents than is typically acknowledged. If you look at some of those earlier state court cases in the 19th century, just as public schooling was beginning, what you find is that again and again, state courts say that the rights of parents extend into the schoolhouse, right? They don't end at the schoolhouse door, that that parents can, for instance, select among the subjects offered. So if they decide that, I don't want Susie to take that class on Friday afternoon, I want her to be able to come home and spend more time studying the other subjects because I don't think that class is very important. Well, the parent has that right. That's just one kind of example. But I think that this looking at Pierce through the common law precedents helps us understand a kind of more expansive role for respecting parental rights, even inside kind of determining what is part of the public school curriculum and what students kind of have to be exposed to within the public school.
All right, well, Graham,
Can I jump back in there, keep the debate going?
okay, Graham, I believe because of this deliberative character of this event, we're not doing questions now. We're saving those for the deliberation.
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
So with that in mind, we have reached our time. We're sorry for the late start. Thank you so much, Professor Black. Thank you so much, Professor Michela. You've given our deliberators an excellent start, and we really appreciate you taking the time to discuss these important issues with us.
Thank you both. Yes.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, professors, for a stimulating conversation tonight. And hopefully this means that this will give a catalyst for some, vigorous conversation, deliberation with all of you and with all of you online. So now you will all have a chance to share your own insights. I know you're kind of chomping at the bit. You want to, jump in, and now you can. You can, share your thoughts and also listen to one another's perspectives on these complex and important issues.